ultimately dismantle any of it if we don't stick to a intensely radical politics.
You're not broke if you're taxing rich people.
We break production for profit and we replace it by production for need.
This event is brought to you by Haymarket Books. Now more than ever, it is critical to support independent publishers, independent bookstores, and independent voices. There are two ways you can do this today. First, by buying books from Haymarket at haymarketbooks.org. And secondly, by joining the Haymarket Book Club. The following event will be recorded and shared afterwards on the Haymarket Books YouTube channel. Please subscribe to the channel, like this video now, and share it with as many people as possible. If you like this event, be sure to catch these upcoming events in Haymarket's live stream series. You can register for these upcoming events on the Haymarket Books Eventbrite page. If you miss an event, you can listen to the recording afterward by subscribing to our podcast, Haymarket Live, wherever you get your podcasts. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items. We are moderating the chat, but we cannot guarantee that everyone will observe our community guidelines. People who violate these guidelines will have their comments deleted as quickly as we are able. This event will have live closed captions. Instructions for accessing the captions will be posted in the chat. We should have time for Q&A, so please post your questions in the YouTube chat window, and we'll get to those later in the program. Thanks for joining us today. Our event will begin shortly.
Welcome, folks. My name is Danielle Purifoy, and it's my great pleasure to be in conversation with Lyle C. May today. Today is the publication date of Lyle's book, Witness: An Insider's Narrative of the Carceral State. I had the pleasure of knowing Lyle for the last almost 8 years now, if you can believe it, Lyle. I can't. He is a friend. I consider him a colleague, and we have worked really closely together over the last several years as Lyle's writing career and trajectory have taken off. So I will introduce Lyle. I'll say a little bit about myself and kind of my context in this conversation, and then I'll just be asking, we'll have kind of an exchange to talk about this book and our work together. So here we go. So Lyle C. May is a prison journalist and abolitionist whose writings have appeared in Scalawag Magazine, The Intercept, Inside Higher Ed, and elsewhere. Lyle May is also a co-author of Inside, Voices from Death Row, and contributor to Right Here, Right Now, Life Stories from America's Death Row. And And my name, again, is Danielle Purifoy. I am a lawyer and a geographer, and I am one of the former editors at Scalawag, which is a media organization devoted to Southern politics and culture. And I'm based in North Carolina as well. And I started working with Lyle as in my capacity as editor, the Race and Place editor at Scalawag back in 2016. And Lyle and I, met through a program that, was devoted to cultivating writers in prisons, and particularly on death row. And Lyle's work just really took off in Scalawag back in 2016. And it's been really one of the big honors of my life to see his writing, see him introduced to newer audiences, and to see kind of his rising profile kind of culminating at this moment in this book on Haymarket Books, Witness and Insider's Narrative of the Carceral State. And I was really fortunate and honored to be asked to write the foreword to this book. And I'll talk a little bit about, we can talk a little bit about why Lyle asked me to write that foreword. But I want to just kind of start, Lyle, with, just having you talk a little bit about the book itself. So what is this book about? What is Witness and Insider's Narrative of the Carceral State about? And why did you decide to write it?
Thank you. Witness and Insider's Narrative of the Carceral State actually began as this idea of a collection of not just articles that I had written for Scalawag magazine, but also other essays I had published in other academic journals and different online formats. And I reached a spot where I was like, oh, well, I seem to be generating a lot of different writing, so maybe I should put it all together in one place, because there was a narrative there that I really think people need to see and couldn't necessarily see if they read one article here or one article there. By kind of collecting all of those, there was an ability to kind of see that there's more information together than there was apart, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So when I began putting these essays and these articles together, that also included lectures that I'd been fortunate to give at various universities, and they filled some of the academic gaps that were left in the articles and essays I had published, largely because it's kind of hard in some formats to write academic things, especially like, say, for example, deterrence. We always talk about deterrence in relation to crime and punishment, but seldom do you see an article published in the newspaper about it. So this was really an opportunity to kind of bring a lot of these different parts together into a very cohesive whole. Mm-hmm. So it'll help you to know that Witness is organized into parts. The first part being State of Violence, Capital Punishment, and Death Row, which is 8 chapters and covers large...
You have 60 seconds remaining.
And various elements of death penalty, not just simply the experience, but also some of the economics, the psychology, the sociology, and criminology behind it, as well as the history. And then the rest of the book is kind of organized like that into sections. And at the end of each section is frontline snapshots of activism and an interview that I did over the phone from Central.
You have 30 seconds remaining.
With an activist on the outside. The first one being Ben Finhold. Let me call back.
Okay. So folks, one thing to note about this conversation is that Lyle is calling us from Central Prison in Raleigh, and each call can only be 15 minutes. So every 15 minutes or so, he'll have to call back in. And there's going to be some interference as well from auto automated recordings, basically letting us know that the call is being recorded from the prison's end. So these are some of the kinds of communication technology challenges and barriers to speech that incarcerated folks experience. And this is some of the things, too, that Lyle writes about in Witness. Okay, here he's calling back now. Hold on just a second.
You have a prepaid call. You will not be charged for this call. This call is from
Lyle May.
an inmate at Central Prison. This call will be monitored and recorded. For customer assistance, collection, or complete procedures, or to block future calls, dial 1-866-230-7761. To accept this call, press 5 now. To decline this call, thank you for using Global Tel Link.
Hello.
All right, we're back. I explained to the people about what's going on here, but did you want to finish your thought before we move on?
Sure. Ben Finhold is the activist on the outside who ends that first section of State of Violence. Mr. Finhold is an attorney that works with juvenile lifers and as an extension of his work from, I guess you'd say, originally working for North Carolina Prison Legal Services. Mm-hmm. Now he works for a nonprofit. The second part of Witness is Carceral State, which covers life imprisonment and has several chapters discussing kind of the whole idea of life imprisonment without parole being a silent execution, and really going into a lot of the policy changes over time that have made that possible. It wasn't always that way, and I thought that was very important to kind of highlight in this book because it so closely mirrors the death penalty. Part 3 is culture of control, challenging the narrative, and this goes in depth into incarcerated journalism and what exactly that means and why it's absolutely necessary to challenging and misinformation around not just mass incarceration, but crime and punishment, and how media narratives of people who are incarcerated or going through the criminal legal system are misrepresented or not represented as they should be, which is as human beings. The fourth section of Witness is called Witness, Advocacy and Abolition. And these are examples of different types of advocacy and abolition that I've engaged.
This call is from a North Carolina correctional facility.
In particular subject matter such as science versus anti-intellectualism and the death penalty, or protesting death from the inside, and kind of how that takes shape and how difficult that can be. And then the fifth part is the theory of resistance. And I have a special place in my heart for this section, largely because it was written after we collected all the a lot of the previously published or previously written lectures and essays. And it was important to write these chapters because they really put an exclamation point on all that had come before then, because it's not enough to talk about the death penalty or life imprisonment or incarcerated journalism or activism around an abolition. It's important to show what resistance is on the inside and the outside, but also the consequences that are very much a part of prison abolition from the inside and resistance to the idea of that carceral state. Because I think it bears repeating and reminding of people who read this book that we're not free to say or write or do all the things that you might consider on the outside. There can be very real consequences. So there's definitely a lot of risk inherent in that. And I think the theory of resistance and the discussion about solitary confinement and, different types of resistance in prisons over in recent history are important to highlight, not just because I'm not the first person to do this sort of writing or talk about activism in this way or be an activist on the inside. I come from a long line of people who have resisted the abuses of the carceral state. And that, in a nutshell, is how Witness is organized. But I want to emphasize that Witness is more than just a collection of essays and articles and classroom lectures. Witness explores the politics and policies of mass incarceration by examining America's use of the death penalty and life imprisonment. It argues against the need for capital punishment and life without parole by illustrating the human fiscal and moral costs of such sentences, but also their ineffectiveness as a deterrent. Witness illustrates the psychological torment under the credible threat of death by execution and perpetual confinement, and it exposes some of the misinformation that I mentioned embedded in the tough on crime and law and order narratives that are common, not just in the media, but also in TV and movies. Witness is very much incarcerated journalism that relies on experience and scholarship to inform the topics in criminology. And, criminology might seem like a big word, but it's really not. It's just a study of crime, punishment, and corrections. And if you have scholarship around these topics, it's absolutely essential that you include experience, personal lived experience in that study and explanation, because it's often ignored in our discussions about crime and punishment. And that's where a lot of that misinformation comes from, that misinformation by omitting particular perspectives and narratives. So Witness, in a lot of ways, carries out the purpose of the fourth estate, acting as a check and balance against elected officials who orchestrate and maintain the carceral state, and calling out media outlets that parrot state narratives. And it's so crucial these days when there's just a lot of rhetoric and a lot of anger, really, in the way that it's presented, the way that crime is viewed and understood, especially when we talk about, crime waves and this use and abuse of statistics to kind of manipulate public fears and gain control of policy. And that's really what Witness is about, kind of exposing these efforts by elected officials and these kind of tactics that they use to manipulate the public trust and kind of play on those fears to implement policies that are totally ineffective and absolutely abusive of power. So Witness uncovers these anti-intellectualist agendas that drive draconian criminal and legal policies and proliferate the country with violent human warehouses, but it also is very much front line of account of the fight to dissolve the carceral state, an act of resistance to maintain, an act of resistance to the norm of exceptional brutality that seeks to justify wasting human potential, and a blueprint, very much a blueprint and a map for anyone wanting to help end mass incarceration.
Thank you for that. That's a really beautiful overview of the structure of the book and some of the substance. There's sort of way too much almost, right, for us to talk about in terms of the substance of this book in the time that we have. But I wanted to kind of pivot. You mentioned a few times, right, in your
this call is from a North Carolina correctional facility.
Mentioned a few times in your previous response just now about the importance of study, right? About sort of straddling the lines in your writing and in your lectures and your academic work, right, between the kind of writing that academics want, right, and the kind of writing and delivery that you might read in a newspaper or a magazine. So I think one of the things that it is also reflected, right, pretty prominently in your book is the importance of, education and study, right, and really rigorous study to being able to write, right, period, but across these multiple forms. So I was wondering if you might say a bit, because I know you're writing another book about your education journey, say a bit about the journey that brought you to writing as a general matter, right? And also, right, ultimately to this book and the books that will come afterwards.
Sure. So it's important to understand that I came to prison, I was drowning in ignorance. I didn't know anything, really. The GED that I'd earned in Youth Detention Center in Maine when I was 17 really wasn't worth the paper it was written on, because it didn't help me adjust to society. It didn't help me do much of anything. So when I got to death row, I was pretty dumb. But I think the one thing I had going for me is that I knew I was pretty dumb, and I didn't want to be that way. I wanted to grow and to change. I wanted to distance myself from who the state claimed that I was and prove them wrong. And the only way I knew to do that was to learn. Well, that learning was only partly affected by a lot of the guys that are around me who were older and wiser, and kind of pulled me inside and said, hey, the best way to do your time is to read, is to write, is to get invested in something, so you're not invested in this place. Mm-hmm. And by that they mean simply, distance yourself from the typical day-to-day of prison. So I did read. I actually read a lot of fiction, a lot of science fiction and fantasy, and, kind of really got lost in the idea of different worlds, and, was ultimately, drawn to role-playing games and Dungeons and Dragons, and that's where I started learning to write kind of narratives, although they were fictional narratives. But one of the things that really kind of drew me to writing and reporting on the inside is what I didn't see in newspaper narratives, and that was I didn't see myself represented in those narratives. When the journalists who were covering the death penalty referred to the people as killers and murderers, and none of the people I talked to on a daily basis think of themselves that way or refer to themselves as that. And I certainly don't, as somebody who is fighting a wrongful conviction. So that was part of it. But then the other part was when these discussions or these reports were coming out in the newspaper about what was or wasn't going on in the prison system, they totally missed the mark. So that was kind of where the seed of wanting to write came from. My ability developed, though, when I was first offered access to higher education through college correspondence programming by a private local church sponsoring that. And basically 2 or 3 courses every year. I would complete these courses first through UNC Chapel Hill and then Ohio University, where I ultimately earned an associate's in arts degree with a social science emphasis, and then, transitioning from that into studying the law, because the fact remains that being on death row and under the active threat of death, you kind of need to know about the law. You have to know about what it means to fight a post-conviction capital appeal and, pursue due process as maybe the most important civil right of our time. And in doing so, in learning these different subjects and gaining the tools and ability to not just adapt to my circumstances, but to overcome them, education very much became that life preserver, that multi-purpose tool that I drew from again and again and again, to the point where when I did select courses, it was always about practical application. If I couldn't take a course and find a practical application for it in my environment, or how I could possibly use it or think of using it down the road, I didn't want to take it. So that's where a lot of frustration came for those general education requirements that are required of all.
You have 60 seconds remaining.
But also it let me know that I didn't really have any kind of set degree in mind. It was more about what can I use to help myself? How can I apply it? And what can be done with it in such a way that it manifests in a beneficial way, not just for myself, but for those around me. And that's kind of how my education developed.
You have 30 seconds remaining.
How I applied it to writing.
Got it. Thank you for that. I'm gonna let you, since you only have 30 seconds, let you go ahead and call back before we move forward.
All right.
Okay. So just a second, folks. We will we will be back. One of the things that I'll just say is that as an educator, I'm a professor at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I have and I was actually on my own education journey in my doctoral program when I met Lyle. And was working for Scalawag. And one of the things that was so striking, right, about working with him was learning about the total kinds of restrictiveness, right, of education access, particularly to folks on death row. And so we don't have time to kind of go into it in any more depth, but I think it's really important facet of this conversation is those limitations and those barriers.
Lyle May.
An inmate at Central Prison. This call will be monitored and recorded. For customer assistance, collection, or complaint procedures, or to block future calls, dial 1-866-230-7761. To accept this call, press 5 now. To decline this call, thank you for using Global Tel Link.
Hello.
All right, we're back. So I feel like this might be a good opportunity. I mean, I was just saying to folks that when you and I met, I was on my own kind of education journey to become an educator and a researcher. And, you know, you and I had many conversations about the various barriers and restrictions that existed to your own education, right? As someone who particularly, I mean, there are restrictions as a general matter to people who are incarcerated for education, but there's a very specific restriction, right, for folks who are incarcerated on death row. And I know we don't have a ton of time to talk about that, but that, you know, it was striking that, you know, I was, you know, in school with folks often who were struggling to make meaning of the education that they had access to. And, you know, all the while people who are incarcerated, people who are the most disenfranchised, right, amongst us, don't even have the access to the choice of having education. So there's failures of our education system writ large, right, at every level. And I think, you know, it's one of the reasons why I thought it was so important to talk about it a little bit to hear here. But I want to kind of move forward. And yeah, let's maybe talk a little bit about if you want to, our kind of relationship here. So you asked me to write this forward to this book, and I'm happy to say more about it. But yeah, I mean, let's talk a little bit about your time at
North Carolina
Scalawag.
Correctional Facility.
Yeah, talk a little bit about your time at Scalawag, and the kind of connectivities you and I made, and I'll obviously chime in, but I'll let you kind of take the lead here.
Okay, so, you know, we talk about education, and that was actually my first essay for Scalawag. It was really a letter from death row was kind of the title, but the subtitle discusses why we must educate our prisoners. And it talked a little bit at the time. I was still kind of early in my writing about education, but it talked about how important not just my access to education has been, but also how anomalous it is, because the reality is that most people on death row are not educated. I am one of a handful of people who has an undergraduate degree. My access is solely because a private sponsor decided to take an interest in my future and my potential to learn. For the most part, people on death row don't have those opportunities. It is only now in 2024, after Governor Roy Cooper's executive order to improve rehabilitation and reentry services, that people on death row are being offered access to a GED program, and that faces its own sort of resistance. So higher education is a whole different level apart from that, because in general, people believe it's a privilege that it shouldn't be afforded to people on the inside, or anybody that can't afford it, really. It's not even just the people who are on the inside. There's active resistance to people being given free access to higher education. And that's, largely how I reach out to Scowag, through kind of an endeavor on the inside to create our own magazine on death row that didn't go too far, but Scalawag had expressed an interest in that, one of the articles I written, and that first one was about higher education and why that kind of funding needs to occur more, especially for those who are serving extreme sentences of life and death imprisonment. So that's, kind of how we first paired up. You were my editor then, and I'm kind of glad that we had that opportunity. I'm absolutely glad that we had opportunity to meet in that way, and I certainly have greatly benefited from it, not just as a writer, but as a human being. He's helped me grow, and I'm absolutely and grateful to you for your friendship as well. And that's why I absolutely needed you to write the foreword for this book, not just because I know that you yourself write, but also because I know that your uncle had been incarcerated and was serving life terms in another state, and you have a special kind of relationship with the prison system. And that's not a perspective that I can write about, and that's not a perspective that's often preferred space. And I wanted to create that space in this book for you, particularly as a friend, but also as a writing mentor and editor, as somebody who suffers at the hand of the carceral state.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I mean, it's such an immense honor. On my end, to get a chance, get an opportunity to work with you. I remember back in 2016 when this opportunity arose at Scalawag to work with incarcerated writers in North Carolina. Most of our editors at that time were based here in North Carolina, and our headquarters was here. And we really had, a lot of us were academic types, people who were either going into kind of law or academia, in some way or another. And this work, as growing abolitionists that we were, a lot of us were, we were really wanting to have an opportunity to, work directly with folks who were on the inside and to publish their work. And I remember vividly, right, the kind of connectivities that I immediately made, right, back to my own familial experience with this, which has been, somewhat limited. I didn't meet my uncle actually officially until I was 18 years old. Even then, because I didn't grow up in Michigan and because I wasn't in Michigan very often, I didn't get to see him a lot. And our correspondence was spotty. It was off and on, but it was there and it was present. And He was one of my Uncle Ralph. His name is Ralph Purifoy. He was one of the people who first pushed me to start interrogating more critically the criminal legal system. I think that even within my family, right, he loomed, right, as this absence in our lives. He was incarcerated from a North
Carolina correctional facility.
He was incarcerated before I was born. He was incarcerated in the 70s. He was a Vietnam War vet, and there were so many people who were veterans of war in general, and particularly veterans of the Vietnam War that were incarcerated. But, even with that reality within our family, we didn't talk very much, right, about the carceral state. We didn't talk very much about the criminal legal system. I think it was too painful in a lot of ways. But he got me curious. His experience and the somewhat limited contact that I had with him got me curious about what is this thing called the criminal legal system, what people call the criminal justice system. And I don't think, really without that push kind of earlier on in my younger days that I would have, approached my work at Scalawag in the way that I did, or have had as much kind of interest, right? And enthusiasm, I think, about taking this on. I had worked previously with at a youth detention center in Massachusetts when I was in law school on a writing project there. I had worked with men who were in transitional housing in Boston on writing projects. And I knew that reading and writing, various forms of creative expression were the kinds of things that I like to do and the kinds of offerings that I had, and certainly felt like a really, really the most powerful exchanges that I had that helped me to grapple, right, answer some of these questions that my uncle's incarceration brought to me within the criminal legal system. So my uncle died of COVID-19 in 2021, February of 2021, after having been incarcerated for about 42 years. He should have been released long before COVID hit, and certainly should have been released from prison when COVID hit. He was about 70 years old at the time, so he was already at risk as an elder, but the parole board in Michigan would not waiver, would not release him, even though he had a life sentence that included a possibility of parole, and so it was a failure, a devastating failure, and a deadly failure, right, on the state of Michigan and its parole board and its system, and and not releasing my uncle, and ultimately leading to his death. And I think that my relationship with you, Lyle, was one of the first times that I had been able to build a kind of close one-to-one relationship, right, with someone who was on the inside. This is the kind of relationship that, had I been in Michigan, right, had I been closer geographically, I might have been able to build with my uncle. And so, and building that relationship with you really made it clear to me, right, at least some of what my uncle endured, right, and made clear some of the things that he was writing to me about. So I think it's been, again, the honor of my life to be able to work directly with you, right, and to learn from you. Even as I'm getting my own education, right, or I was at the time, and and then to be asked to write this forward was just an immense gift, so I'm very grateful to that, and to you for opening up these possibilities for me as well. Yeah.
thank you. And I think that we both learned a lot from one another. And what your uncle suffered and experienced is something that I hope to be able to highlight with Witness. That kind of the idea of the normalcy of exceptional brutality that is essentially the systemic devaluation of human life, and this idea that, there need not be mercy or compassion attached to the criminal legal system or incarceration. And that's just wrong. It's fundamentally wrong in a way that is not or should not be part of this country.
Yeah, for sure. So I want to pivot just a bit to kind of talk about the connectivities between your writing, and advocacy, on the ground in North Carolina, right? Because you are not just writing to educate, right? You're writing to activate people, right? So you, in chapter 20 of this book, it's called Keeping the People Ignorant When Censorship Contributes to Misinformation.
You have 60 seconds remaining.
Around mass incarceration. I'll finish this question and then we can call back. You discuss in that chapter how the activism that you and I, via a formation called Durham Beyond Policing, engaged in around the Durham County Commission's decision to build a $30 million youth jail was suppressed. What were when we come back, we'll talk about what your key takeaways were from getting involved in this type of activism. Okay, I'll let you call back.
All right.
You have a prepaid call. You will not be charged for this call. This call is from
Lyle May.
an inmate at Central Prison. This call will be monitored and recorded. For customer assistance, collection, or complete procedures, or to block future calls, dial 1-866-230-7761. To accept this call, press 5 now. Thank you for using Global Tel Link.
Hello.
Hey, okay. Sorry, we are back. Yep.
So regarding my participation in this activism, when you first asked me about it, or even just kind of mentioned what was going on, you probably wouldn't have even had to ask me. I was already thinking in the lines of like, man, I just wish there was something I could do, but it helped, kind of mold that desire to do something, to be active around this topic, into writing a letter to the Durham County Commission expressing why exactly I didn't think they needed to build a $30 million youth jail and how they could have better invested that money. And it wasn't just an idea of writing this letter. It's like, I know I'm not the only one with these experiences. There are a number of my peers who have been through youth detention centers and in the juvenile justice system and were, destroyed by them. They were crippled by their inability to adjust after juvenile incarceration, after solitary confinement and abuse by staff, much as I was. And the Durham County Commission needs to understand that was essentially what they would potentially create by building this new facility. So, in writing that letter to them and expressing, kind of, not just my concerns, but my experiences and those of my peers who signed on to this letter, we were also explaining to the commission how a lot of reforms, criminal legal reforms throughout history, start as good ideas, but ultimately become
This call is from a North Carolina correctional facility.
Some of the more egregious things about incarceration, about prisons. And this is not any different. By building a $30 million facility at a time when the entire country is facing a staffing crisis in all of its prisons, it seems really misguided, because even though you're going to build this brand new facility and create this space where you claim that you're going to help juveniles who are entering the system, you're on the flip side of that good intention, creating a space for people who have yet to even have committed a crime. And that's problematic. That's something where you can say, oh, well, we should have taken this money and prevented the crime, as opposed to saying we're taking this money and punishing the crime after the fact, which is basically all prisons do, is they're after the fact measures that do nothing to address crime and punishment. And that's largely where the seed of my desire and interest in participating in this particular type of activism came from. And then, I gave the letter to you, and I couldn't have predicted, or maybe I should have predicted, what happened after we submitted the letter, but, that's kind of the whole purpose of this particular chapter in discussing that you can be active and speak out and get involved in trying to halt the advance of the prison industrial complex. But there are so many forces at work that it's important to understanding. It's not just about speaking out. It's about understanding those forces. And by those forces, I mean specifically how often that information is kept out of the public eye. And that was maybe the most shocking thing about that activism, is that after we'd sent that letter to the commission and they voted to build the youth facility anyways, which, as you mentioned to me the other day, now stands completed, which is awfully fast for any facility to be created, was, kind of the resistance to talking about it in the media. We did, we had three particular efforts. I did 2 interviews, and then you and we co-wrote an op-ed, and none of those efforts made it into the public eye. And that was strange, even for this particular thing. And it was strange in a way that really just kind of emphasizes the critical nature of getting the public to understand what they receive in terms of information from the state, but not just the state, but from mainstream media outlets about the prison industrial complex, about the creation of youth jails and prisons is not all there is to know about it. They're getting a very small glimpse, and then that glimpse is curated. Well, in writing this particular chapter, Keeping the People Ignorant, that's what I'm referencing, and that's why prison journalism is very much an act of resistance, not simply to the carceral state, but to that mainstream narrative that leaves out critical information.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think just to, give folks just even a little more context to this, one of the things that, Lyle, if you remember, that you said to me when I told you kind of in passing, I think, about this $30 million youth jail that they were going to build in Durham that they call, of course, euphemistically, a youth home. And, you said that, most of the folks who are on death row with me were incarcerated as young people. And I was really struck by that, immediately, because so much of the narrative actually around that youth jail was this sense that even as young people, right, the idea that there were just some young people that could not be reasoned with, right? There were some young people that could not be treated as young people or as children, and that they deserved, or rather needed, right, incarceration to set them straight. And it really hit home for me about how quickly a person can become disposable, right, in the eyes of the state. These were county commissioners, right? These were people who had been elected, people who, Black county commissioners even, right, whose own lives had been scarred, right, by the criminal legal system, but nevertheless, right, adopted this very particular rhetoric around some children just not being beyond help, right? And, it's very much a similar conversation or a similar kind of rhetoric around incarcerated people generally, but particularly folks on death row. And I was struck too, right, about the lack of desire to engage this topic, right, in the press, as though it was something that was an inevitability, as though it was something that
from
wasn't,
the North Carolina Correctional Facility,
as though it was something that wasn't worthy of discussion. So yeah, I just, Lyle gathered statements from the people on his block, right, on death row, to put forth, right, a protest to the Durham County Commissioners. And I will say that when I read Lyle's letter aloud at the county commission, the commissioner was so angry that, she did everything she could to cut me off when time happened. And when I was out of time, I kept reading. But there was a kind of fury, right, and a shock, I think, because these commissioners never expect to hear directly from people who are incarcerated, right? They never expect that. And so it was really a stunning kind of, level of defiance and shock, right? But it was a very powerful statement that, the folks who were in that room that night, attested, right, to the power of that statement and to the, right, like utter, to my mind, cowardice, right, on behalf of the county commission to not even halt this process for long enough to think about, what other kinds of directions they could go in. So yeah, just thank you for that.
Didn't somebody thank you afterwards? It was kind of unusual to hear from.
Yes. So actually, one of the, ironically, the sheriff's department that night was rallying for higher pay. And so they were in the room to kind of hear all of our testimonies, because this was during the budget cycle for the county commission. This was just a couple of years ago. And yeah, afterwards, one of the sheriff's deputies himself came up to me and said, I really thank you for giving, that testimony from death row, because it's real clear to me that we need to be doing something else with our young people. So it was really a striking moment, right? Because the sheriff's department in Durham and in a lot of counties are who are in charge of policing children in schools. And so it's a very, that nexus is really close, and it was powerful and ironic, obviously, as well, to kind of hear from a sheriff's deputy about that. Yeah.
That was certainly something that I found both very interesting, but also very telling, is the close nature of that nexus of relationship, and how much effort is put into distancing ourselves from it. And that's, a large part of the problem is that lack of proximity. And I think that's probably what shocked them the most, is that we brought proximity to them.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And I think that, that's such the power of, your writing, right? And your organizing as well. It was really astonishing, right, to kind of read those testimonies and read those words. So yeah, let's, continue on here. I mean, I have, so many other questions to ask you. I want to kind of get a sense of, we've talked about, your relationship with Scalawag a bit. We haven't talked as much about, the lectures that you've delivered in college classrooms, but I'm curious about how kind of this combination of work, right? Work as a sort of freelance writer for various publications, and then also being asked into various classrooms across the years kind of got you to the point where you, became an author on Haymarket Books, right? Which is, known, this press is not just any press, right? It's a press that's known for publishing abolitionists, right? For publishing the works of people who are on the front lines of dismantling the prison industrial complex. Maybe say a little bit about that process, because it's a leap, right, for anyone, right, on the inside or outside, and it's a really profound accomplishment.
Well, thank you. I got my first opportunity to speak in a college classroom through Dr. Frank Baumgartner, who teaches at UNC Chapel Hill, and he teaches political science. He'd actually seen one of my articles published by Scalawag magazine and, had his students read it. And I was extended the offer to call in and talk to his students a little bit, not just about the particular article. I believe at the time it was Life Without Parole is a Silent Execution, but also, kind of what drew me to writing about policy in particular. What came from that was this...
You have 60 seconds remaining.
Desire to do it again, of course. Speaking that first time in a classroom is the first time I'd ever spoken in a classroom in front of a group of people like that. Even though I'm not technically there were nearly 400 people who were listening to what I had to say about life without parole as a policy. And that really set my mind on fire with the potential of it, not just in...
You have 30 seconds remaining.
About the politics and policies behind these particular punishments, but also for where it would lead. Let me call that.
Okay.
You have a prepaid call. You will not be charged for this call. This call is from
Lyle May.
an inmate at Central Prison. This call will be monitored and recorded. For customer assistance, collection, or complaint procedures, or to block future calls, dial 1-866-230-7761. To accept this call, press 5 now. To decline this call, hang up. Thank you for using Global Tel Link.
Hello.
Hey. Okay, we're back.
So one of the things I think at this point that I recognized was not just the potential for calling in and instructing students in this way, but also how, as an extension of my writing, this resulted and what that meant, what that kind of responsibility meant. And I say responsibility because when I began writing, I didn't really see it as a responsibility, but the more I was given space to write and the more articles I had published, the more that I recognized, like, hey, this is as much a responsibility as having access to higher education. It meant that I had this platform where people were willing to listen, to give me the opportunity to convince them of what it was that I was talking about. And in doing these lectures, this was a very direct way to do that. And, I was essentially thrusting myself into the role of a teacher. And that was a very both unique experience, but also very much an honor to be able to, to do that. And I was always very grateful to have those kinds of opportunities. So I also recognize, and this is where my higher education played a very pivotal role, is how to use that in a way that builds on itself. And what I mean by that is simply that, after doing that first talk in the classroom, I asked the professor to write a letter of reference for me. And then I took that along with a sample of the talk to the next professor and asked her if I could do the same thing in her classroom. Then I kind of
This call is from a North Carolina correctional facility.
To the point where I was doing it in multiple classrooms, and not just classrooms, but also in church groups, at conferences, and it just kind of grew from there. And how that culminates into creating a book is bringing those two pieces together, both the writing and the public talks, because the public talks were different from the writing. And it was like I said, that it was, almost like injecting it directly into the public. Whereas, the writing, you have to read it, you have to kind of absorb it, you have to get access to it. So there's a little bit different. In that sense, then in taking these lectures, the information wasn't too much different from what I was writing about in articles and essays. It was just a more distilled version. So there wasn't as much to go through in terms of like the description and illustration. So incorporating that into this book, Witness, an Insider's Narrative of the Carceral State, I think comes from just this understanding that what began as an attempt to explain and illustrate through essays and then inform through articles and then teach through public lectures becomes this holistic picture of this journey that I've been on and that I want to take others on in explaining an insider's narrative of the carceral state. And that's what this is all about, challenging the narrative that people understand about prisons and people who are in prison, to challenging their understanding about crime and punishment and what they hear on the nightly news, to challenging this false identity that is placed on people who go through the criminal legal system. And that's really what Witness is all about, a direct challenge behind punishment.
Okay, Lyle, maybe say that last part again because you broke up a little bit. Just like the last two sentences of what you said. Sorry.
Great. Well, Witness is kind of the encapsulation of my effort to challenge the way people are identified in prison, to how people, same people are by mainstream media, not just mainstream media, but elected officials in general, how they identify incarcerated people, and to challenge that typical understanding. And that's what Witness is really all about.
Great. Yeah, so I think let's start wrapping up, because I think you really covered so much ground here today. But I kind of want to end with a question about kind of where you are now with your work, kind of where you're headed. But I want to also ask a little bit about how you do your work. So in Witness, you describe the sort of quote unquote normalcy of exceptional brutality that justifies dehumanizing legal policies. And yet in your writing, in your work, right, how you do it, right, you don't sound defeated, right, as many people would. And so I'm wondering, I'm thinking about Miriam Kaba, her statement that hope is a discipline, right? I'm wondering about where you draw your hope from, right? And how you convey it to others in a way that helps them resist despair. And maybe in talking about this sort of how you do your work, you can talk a little bit about what's coming up next for you, right? In terms of what you're up to in your writing and advocacy.
Sure. So in terms of the normalcy of exceptional brutality, this idea that the systemic evaluation of human life, where civil discourse can be thought of as normative, so too can the idea that punishment as vengeance and as an extension, the diminishment of others. In that distancing, it has become easy for society to throw other human beings away. And for those who have been discarded, the forsaken, so to speak, the poor and marginalized who live within the confines of that disregard, despairs the enemy. And despairs the enemy because it erodes one's ability to respond to suffering in such a way that is both effective and progress-oriented. This demands hope. There will not only be a better day, but that you can be an agent of change that generates that better day. This means believing in your ability to determine tomorrow and taking steps to improve upon it. That said, hope can come from many places, but I draw my hope from belief God will not give me more than I can handle. And when the burden is too much, I pray and often feel reinvigorated.
This call is from a North Carolina correctional facility.
This reinforces my belief there is purpose in any suffering I may experience. And I draw that directly from the idea forwarded by Viktor Frankl in Man's Search for Meaning. So in a way, despair is defeated by hope, which comes from many sources, as I said, but the surest path is a life lived with conviction and purpose. And that's where I often hope is by the momentum of the work that I do. And that means perpetually working, perpetually writing, perpetually thinking about the different aspects that people simply don't understand, not just about prisons and incarceration, but the criminal legal system at large. And that's kind of the new front I've opened up in my writing through writing about those policies in a more legalistic manner. In fact, the next thing I have coming out is a co-authored law review article through New York University's Review of Law and Social Change. My co-authors, Dr. Brittany Ripper and Dr. Robert Johnson, we put together this law review article. It's titled "The Constitutionality of Life Under the Credible Threat of Death by Execution, The View from Death Row." And in it, we forward two very simple arguments. One, that capital punishment, the threat of capital punishment, is a form of psychological torture because the average citizen isn't allowed to threaten to kill somebody. Mm-hmm. So this is a crime because it's a form, not just you're robbing somebody of their sense of safety and well-being, you're actively putting them under a form of mental duress, that psychological torture that I speak of in this article. And not just speak of, but prove with extensive research from people who have come before me. The second element of this particular article is the idea that the state constitution, in this particular example, North Carolina state constitution, provides greater protection against this form of torture than the federal constitution through the distinction of one single word, and that's the disjunctive term "or" under the state constitution, which says that it prohibits cruel or unusual punishment, so that means you only have to prove one element, versus the federal constitution's cruel and unusual punishment, which states that you have to prove both elements. Mm-hmm. And that sounds pretty complex, and in some ways it can be, and it's very, very much why this is a law review article, but it's also very nuanced and very necessary. Because oftentimes when we talk about abolition of the death penalty, we talk about conditions of confinement, we talk about this idea of the lethal injection protocol, whether, it's cruel to stab somebody with a needle multiple times and inject them with chemicals versus making them suffocate through nitrogen hypoxia. So we often talk about the death penalty and abolition in those sense, whether it's constitutional on a fundamental level, but rarely, if ever, have we talked about the death penalty being unconstitutional because it's psychologically torturous in the simple act of the threat itself. And not just for those who are on death row, but also for those who are leveraged into plea bargains to take life without parole to avoid the death penalty. You have prosecutors that effectively threaten people with the death penalty to get them to plead guilty, and that's, fundamentally wrong. And that's where this Law Review article discusses this threat.
Great. So any sort of final words or, things you might want to say to your audience as they, as they pick up this book?
Sure. My ask is simply that you read it thoroughly and that you don't have to take my word for it. I tell this to students all the time. I have a perspective. I have experience. I certainly have some scholarship in my background, and I get a lot of what I get from my peers. But you don't have to take our word for it. Certainly do your own due diligence. Look into the sources that I use in witness, because that's something else I kind of pride myself on. I develop a lot of my arguments from other scholars. These are not things that I pull out of thin air. It's thoroughly researched and cited and sourced, and backing up these experiences that I have. So, yes, please read Witness, share Witness with your friends and your family, talk about Witness, post it online, get others to read it, and read the other works that I cite in these places. I definitely encourage you to read the work of Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. Like I said, I draw from him. Rachel Lee Barkow, who wrote Prisoners of Politics, Breaking the Cycle.
You have 60 seconds remaining.
Brian Jarvis, who wrote Cruel and Unusual Punishment in U.S. Culture. These are some of the sources that I refer to. There are others. But again, please read and act on it. That's the main thing. Act on these things that you have learned through Witness. And I am grateful to you for having me and listening to the things that I say.
You have 30 seconds remaining.
Thank you so much, Lyle. Really appreciate you, and congratulations on the release of this really incredible book.
Thank you. And I appreciate you, Danielle, and all of Haymarket for making this possible.
All right. We'll let Lyle go, but I just encourage everybody to pick up this book, Lyle May, Witness, an Insider's Narrative of the Carceral State, published today, April 16th, and it is available at Haymarket Books. Hope you can pick up your copy, and thank you. Thank you for listening in, and take care.